Welcome to the Arboretum on a pretty nice fall day with a beautiful tree behind me. This is the information module. This is the beginning of the information module in the Google section, and what I've tried to do in these information modules is give you an insight into information as a subject, information as a particular area of study. We've talked about social issues. You know that psychologists and sociologists, they often talk about those sorts of social issues. We talk about technological issues. Those are things that programmers, system administrators, and other forms of technologists deal with. And then there's the information modules that we've done. And in these information modules, I've tried to give you a feeling, and I'll continue to try to give you a feeling for the subject of information. So today what we're going to talk about is user experience and information architecture as two sort of umbrella terms or two cover terms for what people do considering information in large-scale web systems, and certainly they do this inside of Google as well. Okay, so let's back up a little bit and talk about what we decided we were going to do in this class. We said we will talk about three different applications: Facebook, Google, and World of Warcraft, and inside of each of those we'll talk about technology, social issues, and information. We could have said we're going to talk about technology, people, and information, because really the social issues are all about people and how they use information. But I didn't say people, I said social issues for a very particular reason, and that's because inside the creation and design of information systems, the word people doesn't usually apply to the broad social issues, you know, of identity or abuse or anything that we've talked about before. What it really usually applies to is three very particular kinds of people. A, the people who are paying for the system, the organization that sponsored the creation of some kind of information system, the people who use that information system, and the people who are in the process or in the staff that will create that system. So we have the people paying, which is usually some organization. We have the people that are creating the system, which are the workers, the architects and the designers and the content people, et cetera, and then we have the users, the people who use those systems. So those three kinds of people really are the people of most concern to the designers and creators of information systems, and that's what we're talking about now. What do we do to create and design, or design and create an information system? So obviously we have to deal with technology, and we've talked enough about technology in other places that I won't mention it too much right here. Then there's the people, as I mentioned, the organization that pays for it, the staff that creates it, and the users that ultimately are the target for the information system, the people who will be getting information from the system. And then there's the information itself. And we've already talked, at least I've begun to bring out the two major domains inside this information. One is the model of the information, and the other is the life cycle of the information. And so I'll go back over that a little bit more, and we're going to focus in on some specifics. And in this lecture, I'll particularly pay attention to what I call a deliverable. A deliverable is some kind of work product, something that you're assigned by someone in your organization that you have to come out with. And I think by looking at the deliverables of user experience and information architecture, it'll give you a very good feeling, A, for what those kind of people do, but B, what the specific things that you have to think of and take into account are. So that's what we're going to dive into. And so this is the big picture here. We'll go into more detail about specific parts of it that I haven't talked about before, or that we're ready to talk about at this point. Okay, so this term user experience is sort of an umbrella term. It's a relatively new term, you know, not that old, and it's kind of it's a term that people have used to group together all the different kinds of things that they might do in the let's say non-technological or not thoroughly technological aspects of information system creation. And I know that's really vague. It's really vague to me as well. All the terms that we use in this class are in flux, but this one particularly is really in flux. However, a lot of people identify with it, so it's a term that we'll use. And in fact, in the other video that you watched for this module, Dan, the user experience, or I guess he's the user happiness Uber lead, right, for Google, he talked a lot about user experience and gave you, I think, a fair appraisal of what user experience is from their standpoint. And so just to briefly rephrase that, user experience really is, and this is the way that I like to think of it. It might not be everyone's appraisal of the term, but mine is really actually quite close to Dan's. It really is what the terms mean. You're a user. Remember, we talked about three kinds of people. They're the creators, the staff, they're the funders, the people who pay for it, and they're the users, the people who are the targets of the system, right? So that's who we're talking about here, the experience of those users. How do they perceive your system? How do they interact with your system? What do they come out thinking about your system? How do they use your system? Those are all the issues that go into an experience. And if you think about it, that's not so far from the normal way that we use that term experience. You have an experience. I'm having an experience right now. It consists of my interaction with this environment and the way that I proceed through the environment and how I find it and what my opinions are about it and all that kind of stuff. And so that's what I like to think about in user experience as well. But that's pretty sort of out there and theoretical, right? There's some very, very practical parts of user experience, and you can see them outlined in this diagram. And starting sort of at 11 o'clock, we have this idea of usability and accessibility. Very loosely, usability is the idea of how able are people to make it through the system and get their tasks done. How usable is it? How effective is it? Accessibility is those same criteria, but for people who don't have the normal set of sensory apparatus that most people have. So, for example, they might be visually impaired, they might be auditorially impaired, they might be paralyzed in some way, not have full use of their muscles. So how does it work for them? How useful and usable and effective is the application for them? So that's thing number one. Now around to 1 o'clock on the circle here, we have content strategy. I'll talk a little bit more about the idea of strategy in a moment, but briefly this is all the organizational things. How do we get this done? How do we get it accomplished? What's it supposed to do for our organization? What are the goals that we have set out for this, and how are we going to measure progress against those goals? That's the idea there. Then information architecture, which I will also talk about pretty extensively and give you kind of a very good overview of that idea of information architecture presently. But frankly, it's what we've talked about before. This idea of modeling information, organizing information, originating information, retiring information, all those things are the parts of information architecture. And as I said, I'll do some more on that in just a moment. Then we have the functionality. That is, what does this thing actually do? Does it allow you to log in? Does it allow you to buy something? Does it allow you to click from page to page to page? Those are all functions. They're features. They're things that the system does. And those are part of the user experience as well, because in order to interact with an information system, we have to engage its features. We have to engage its functions. So those are also part of user experience. And then we have the platform, mobile versus web, versus maybe a text application, versus maybe printed media, whatever. Those are all the different platforms that our system might run on, and each one has its own user experience criteria. Each one has its own constraints. Each one has its own what they call affordances, the things that it allows to happen, and all of those are taken into account as part of the overall concept of user experience. And then finally, around to the edge there, user interface, which frankly I don't know that I would have broken out as a separate one from platform and functionality, because the platform plus the functionality really decides the user interface. But we've talked about user interface before. It's all the controls and the content and the decoration that goes into putting together a presentation of the information. Right? So that's the circle of user experience. That's the broad idea of user experience. And as I said, I like to really think of it as, how do people interact with this thing? And you can see that all of these different features are parts of how they interact. So these are the broad features of user experience. Let's look now at some of the particulars. I'm not going to go into detail about each of the little boxes on this diagram. It's worth just scanning them and looking at them and trying to think in your own head what each of these is. I will go into specific ones of these as is useful for us as we go forward in this lecture, but I want to give you at least one kind of comprehensive look at a whole lot of the different deliverables, the different things that you have to accomplish, the different work products that you create as someone who works in user experience, and to show you sort of the range, all the way from stories all the way down to specifications. Stories are, you discussing this person's day and how your system fits into their day. And specification goes down to, this button will cause this feature, will access this data, will exist at this part of the page. Very, very, very particular and specific and sort of technical, all the way up to very humanistic. And that's really, I think, the biggest point to take away from this diagram, is that a user experience person spans a lot of territory. Technologists stay in technology, sociologists stay in social issues, psychologists stay inside a single person's mind. A user experience person will be in all of those things all the time and flittering back and forth. And that's why user experience people are often generalists. They're not really great at any one of these things in particular, but they know the whole discipline. They span the whole thing. So if you're that kind of person that goes wide instead of deep, user experience might be something that is of interest to you, because it spans many, many different kinds of disciplines. And the people who are most successful at it tend to be those kind of people who can talk to the techies when they need to, they can talk to the videographers when they need to, they can talk to the business people when they need to, they can talk to anybody. In a way, they're sort of hubs in that sense that they can interact with many different kinds of people, and those many different kinds of people can't necessarily interact with each other. So user experience people oftentimes are in the center, and they're sort of guiding the process along because they know all the different languages. Okay, so now let's dive into a few deliverables before we get specifically into the idea of information architecture. So here's one deliverable. This is along the lines of that content strategy. Or sort of working with the people who are going to pay for the application or the system. And the way that I like to approach this subject is to talk about what will this system do for the organization, who are the key people inside and outside the organization that this system has to serve, and what kind of information is it going to serve to them. And those three put together make the basis of a strategy. A strategy, in any case, in all cases, is what will we do to accomplish our goals? So the first thing to know when you're creating a strategy for an information system or anything else is, what are our goals? What is it we're trying to accomplish? And if you think about it, you'll realize that what you have to accomplish those goals in an information system is information. So somehow information is going to help you get what you want, whether it's more profit if you're a for-profit organization, or whether it's passing laws if you're a government, or changing the world if you're a nonprofit organization. Those are all our different kinds of goals. And what do we have to accomplish those goals? Information. And it turns out information can do a great job of helping you accomplish those goals. But it's not information just in abstract. If you have a book lying on a table and that book can change the world, it isn't going to change the world unless someone reads it, right? There has to be a person involved. There has to be an audience. And in this case, I use the word audience because it's sort of like the audience for a book, or the audience for a movie, or the audience for a song. It's the kind of people who are interested in consuming this sort of information. So we put those three things together to make a strategy. And the strategy, in brief, says if we are able to deliver this sort of information, an information type that we've come up with, to these sorts of people, a kind of person that we've studied, that we know about, then it's going to help us get to this goal. And that's the basis of a strategy. And that's why an organization wants to do an information system in the first place. They have certain goals they want to accomplish. One of their tools for accomplishing those goals is to provide information to people. So the system that provides the information is the next step. But the fact that these kind of people need this kind of information, that's the first step, and that's the strategy step. Okay, so that's a deliverable. A strategy might be a document, for example, that lays all these things out. Here's our goals, here's the kinds of information that we have, here's the kind of people who are going to help us get to those goals using this information, and here's how we believe that's going to work. And then you might go on to say things like, and here's how we're going to measure the effectiveness of this information system. How will we know if it helped us meet our goals? Things like that. Okay, so that's our first deliverable, but we'll talk a lot about other deliverables. Now, let's talk about a deliverable that hits not the people who are going to pay for the system, but a deliverable that talks about the people who are going to make the system, the staff that's going to create the system. And of the various deliverables that might be in this category, the one that I'd like to focus on is something called a workflow, sometimes also called a process flow. Those terms are similar, not exactly the same, but for our purposes, they'll be more or less interchangeable. A workflow, the flow of work. A process flow, the flow of a process. So we for example, looked at the large-scale life cycle of information, right? Create it, store it, organize it, etc. That's sort of a process, right? That's a set of steps that an item of information goes through. You can be much more specific about it and say, for example, the create phase of that life cycle has 10 steps. And they don't all run one after another. It's more like a little procedure or process. If this happens, then go down this trail. If this happens, then go down that trail. And these workflows constitute the instructions to the people who are going to create information in that particular case. Lots of different workflows for lots of different situations. Kind of the most common is about how do we originate or create information. And so a workflow or a process flow is all about the steps we take in order to accomplish something that the staff who are running this system have to accomplish. Maybe it's a monthly update, maybe it's purging old users who are no longer active, maybe it's sending out an email campaign. There's all sorts of things you could have workflows around, and those workflows are deliverable. So you might think, well, what kind of person does those workflows? Well, actually, you know, in the broadest sense of the word, a user experience person would participate in creating those workflows. Or maybe a project manager type of person, someone who's in charge of the staff who creates the system might create that deliverable. Okay, so the deliverable is a workflow or a process flow, and those workflows or process flows are series of steps that you take in order to get to some goal. For example, how to originate a piece of content, how to get this piece of content from the place where someone's writing it all the way through to the place where it's ready to go onto our website, for example. Okay, one more. And this is now a deliverable. We talked about a deliverable that has to do with the people who are paying for the system, a deliverable that has to do with the people who are creating the system. And now let's talk about a deliverable, one among many, by the way, a deliverable that is designed to study the people who are going to use the system, the users. One of the most popular deliverables in the user study realm, or the study of users realm, is called a persona. And you have an example of a persona here. A persona is sort of a character sketch of a kind of user. So for example, suppose we were putting together Google Docs, right? We were the people that are in charge of Google Docs, and we want to know the people, we want to know our users. Why do we want to know our users? Because the better we know them, the better of an application we'll be able to make for them, right? It just makes sense. Know the people that you're serving, and you'll be able to serve them better. So we're the Google Docs team, and we're going to put together, we're the Google Docs team, and we're going to put together some personas. And we say, okay, persona number one is like a business person trying to get something done. Persona number two is a student who's got a student project to get done. Persona number three is a person who now uses the Microsoft product suite, and we want to encourage them to transfer over to the Google product suite for documents. Right? So those are three different classes of people. Now, why do we choose those three classes of people? Well, I think you can kind of see the reason. One reason is because they're going to help us meet our business goal, right? Business goal is to steal business from Microsoft. Who's going to allow us to steal business from Microsoft? Those current Microsoft Office users who are going to try to transition over to Google Docs. So it's worth it for us to understand those people and how to appeal to them and what makes them tick. So that's what a persona is all about. It's an encapsulation of all the studying you've done of a particular variety of people so that you know best how to serve them, so that you can take that into account as you're designing the whole rest of the system. When you're designing the way the information's laid out, when you're designing the functionality, when you're designing the user interface, when you're designing the naming of things on the site, all of those different decisions really have to be informed by who's the person, what kind of person it is. And so this deliverable, this persona deliverable, which as I said often takes shape not dissimilar to the one you see on the screen here, of a picture and a discussion of who this person is, and some statistics about them, and you know what they like, what they don't like, things that they might compare you to. All of these things are part of the persona deliverable, and they help the entire team as well as people outside the team stay focused on the kind of people that the information system needs to serve. Okay, so we talked about a deliverable for the people who pay. We talked about a deliverable for the people who purchase information, who create the information system. A deliverable for the people who are users, and now one more for the people who are users. So the the persona talks about who they are. The use case talks about what they'll do. In a way, it's sort of a process flow. It's not so different than the process flow or the workflow that we talked about earlier for the staff, but now it's applied to the people who are using the system. And we usually assume person comes to our system has some goal. So for example, I am the person who's a current user of Microsoft Word, and I want to see if Google Docs will work for, this is a better one. I want to take my Microsoft Word file and put it into Google Docs and see if I can, do better, quicker, faster, cheaper on Google Docs. There's my scenario, right? That's my setup. And so I walk through a set of steps, and I say, well, what are they going to do? So they're going to have their Word file on their hard drive. They're going to try to click some kind of button to upload it or do something, paste it in or something like that. And then I'll go through a series of steps, and I'll convince myself that that use case, the case of this particular kind of user using my system, is going to result in a feeling of success. Back to the concept of user experience. When they finish that use case, they will feel successful. They will have a good experience. They have a good experience, they're more likely to use my product, they're more likely to use my product, I'm going to meet a business goal. Get the idea? So all of these things are related back up to the goals, In the case of the persona, it's a kind of person that we believe is critical to our success. In the case of a use case, it's the process that we believe they're going to take to get to their goal, and by working through the use cases, we streamline those so that it's going to be most effective for them to do that. Okay, so I hoped in that segment to give you a feeling for the kind of people deliverables that are involved in user experience work. And that was just a sampling. There's many other kinds of user deliverables, but that should be enough at least to give you an idea. Okay, so that's people and user experience. Now let's move on to onto information architecture and talk a little bit more in depth, following up on some of the stuff that we've talked about before to give you a much better feeling for what does the architect, the structural person of information, do. Okay, so I'm going to distinguish, as I said before, user experience is a kind of a vague term. Information architecture is also a kind of a vague term, has a lot of overlap with some of the things we've already talked about. For example, information architects very often create those user deliverables, the personas, the use cases, etc. But I'm going to define something that I'll call the core of information architecture, which is really specifically just about the information. Not that it isn't informed by all the stuff about the users and the design and functionality and all that kind of stuff, but I want to strip away all that stuff and come to really the core of what information architecture is about. And so what I'll say the core of information architecture is a couple things we've already talked about. First, the model, the architecture itself, the structure of the information, right? And so I'll go back over that in just a moment, but I think you should be able to see at this point that when I say information architecture, clearly the modeling of the information, that structure of the information, the types and the items, etc., is a piece of the puzzle, right? And in fact, it's a big piece of the puzzle. Okay, so then it's also all those things that we've already said are in the life cycle: creating it, storing it, organizing it, displaying it, and retiring it. Figuring all those things out, figuring how information is going to be utilized all the way from the time it's created all the way through to the time that it's destroyed eventually, is part of the information architecture core. So figuring out how the information is put together, its structure, that's core to information architecture, and figuring out all these pieces of the life cycle of information and how that model in effect is going to get filled full of information along the journey that a piece of information takes through our system. That's also core to information architecture, or at least how I'll define it. And clearly, this is not an isolated area, which is why these terms are so confused, because you have to do all of the stuff at the same time. And if you're a good person who knows a lot about all the different areas, like I talked about before, sort of that hub person between all the different techies and the designers, etc., it's natural that you'll be able to do a lot more than just this. And so it obviously has overlaps with the technology, it obviously has overlaps with the user stuff, obviously has overlaps with design, with functionality, etc. Okay, so let's go through some of the pieces of information architecture. I'm going to review the structure, sort of the modeling that we talked about, and I'm going to take it one level deeper by then talking about some of the deliverables that you might come up with, as well as some of the user interface that expresses some of the information organization, particularly that we'll go through. So the model that you create, as we've talked about before, is driven by what the organization needs, its goals of the organization, what the users need, and what is inherent in the information. If the information is all about dogs, well, dog information has a certain structure to it, right? You're going to have to talk about breeds, but if the information was about, I don't know, universities, breeds would not fall in there at all, right? The information itself decides a lot. The users of the information decide a lot, and what the organization wants to get from the information also decides a lot. All right, so this is a review. We said that an information model describes information types, and we used the Facebook idea here: person, location, and event. We said that an information model describes the attributes, and so a person has a set of attributes, and those attributes can get kind of complicated, like the name can break down to first name and last name, right? We're in this class going to keep it very simple, but let it be known that the ways that a particular information type is attributed and the complexity of the attributes can just go crazy, and there can be lots of them. This is something I've said before. Okay, and that the information model also describes the patterns, the value patterns. So we're describing the types, we're describing the attributes, and we're describing the patterns of the values that go in those attributes. And here's an example that I pulled from Pandora from an earlier lecture where we had a band. The band, for example, has an ID. The ID is a sequential number. It has a biography. The biography is multiple sentences. It has a picture. That picture is a JPEG, which is a type of image, right? So we've been there before. And we've also said that the information model describes the relationships between types. And so it'll have the relationships between the locations and the locations and the events and the people, showing showing how those are all put together, right? Or it'll have the relationships between a band and a song and another band, for example, and how that's put together. Okay, so that's a quick review of what we talked about information modeling to be about. Here's a quick review of what we talked the information lifecycle to be about, where we create items, we originate them, and remember we talked about authoring or acquiring those items. We store the items. We're going to talk in the next lecture a lot about the storage of items, and we're going to go into detail about the databases that store items. Organizing the items, and this is where we're going to spend the most time through the rest of this lecture, is in what does it mean to organize those items. I gave you a quick overview of that before. I'm going to go much deeper into it now. And when we organize the items, we don't organize a single item. It's like, for example, can you organize one book or one song? No, right? The organization is really about the relationships between those. If I have 100 books, now I can organize them. I have 100 songs or 1,000 songs or 10,000 songs, now I can organize them. In fact, at one song you can organize. At 2 songs it doesn't make any sense to organize. At 10 songs, not really. At 100 songs, yeah, it makes some sense. At 1,000 songs, you can't get away without organizing them, right? Without organizing them, you'll never find your way through them. So the more items of information we have, the more necessary it is for us to organize them. Okay, and then we not only organize the items, we display the items. We put them on a web page. We talked a little bit about that in a previous lecture. We also display the organization. Not only do we display an individual item, for example, an individual song, but we also display the organization of the song. We display an index that has all the songs alphabetically listed, for example. Right? Okay, so that's a quick review of modeling information and also the life cycle of information. Now let's dive into some specifics specifically around this idea of organizing the items. Okay. So we have, I introduced this concept in a previous lecture. What are the basic ways that items are organized? And now we're going to go into detail about each of these 4 basic ways. We said that information items can be organized hierarchically, like in a table of contents, or as you see in the upper corner of this slide, the kind of in a tree type of structure, right? This is almost like a family tree type of structure, right? We have grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, parents, children, grandchildren, right, etc. That's a hierarchy, and I've talked about that term a number of times, and now it's time for us to really kind of get down into it and talk specifically about what it is. So that's the idea of an information hierarchy. We have the idea of an index, and we've talked a lot about indexing already, but mostly in terms of the full text index. We'll spend a little bit more time here talking about things that aren't full text indexes. We have hierarchies, indexes, we have links, and links are point-to-point connections from one piece of information to another piece of information. I'm on boots, so maybe I want to link to socks because boots and socks go together, right? That's the idea of a link. It's not that boots and socks are a hierarchy. It's not that boots and socks are an index. Boots and socks are related to each other, and so there should be a link between those two items of information. And then finally the sequence. And the picture that I like most to describe a sequence is like the beads on a chain or the pearls on a necklace. Each item of information is linked to the next one and the previous one in a long line, like one long story, one after the other. Okay, so this far we've sort of gone. I've talked about these ideas of the hierarchy, the index, the links, and the sequence in a previous lecture. Now let's dive in and talk more specifically about each one of those. But before we do, let's spend just a moment on the idea of who is the organizer? Who actually does the organization? And following some of the work that we did in social issues earlier on, we have the same dichotomy. Maybe the experts do that organization. Maybe the experts do the creation of the hierarchies or the indexes or the sequences or the links. Maybe it's done by people who are highly trained, maybe know a lot about the information, maybe do this all day long, that's their job, right? Those are experts. Gone through school for it, etc., graduated the iSchool, and now they do this for a living, right? Could be done by them. Or could be done by the crowd. Could be done by the mob out there in cyberspace. Right, so those are the 2 possibilities, and we've talked about this before. You could have experts doing stuff, or you can have people in general who may or may not be experts who just are interacting with the information doing it. So if it's experts, there's a number of names we might call these experts, a number of sort of job titles that they go under. Kind of the most popular, I think, these days is the name taxonomist. So if you run into somebody and they say they're a taxonomist, what they're doing is they're creating this organization. They're figuring out how all the different pieces of information fit together. They might be called indexers because they create indexes. They might be called abstractors because they take a big amount of information and they abstract it down to the essence, to the small amount of information, and that's a way also of organizing information. They may be called catalogers because they put information into a catalog. They create a catalog, which is a great collection of all the pieces of information and how they all fit together. They could be called taggers. Sometimes they're called taggers because they add tags to the information. That's one of the ways that we specify the organization and information, is by adding something called a tag, and so these guys could be called tags. Or the word that I really like, but it's really a very obscure word because I made it up, a metator. A metator is a person who adds metadata to information. And I won't go any further. I just had to put it on here because, as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the names, but really the rest of the world doesn't think that way. Only me. Okay, so those are various names for these people if they're the experts. Various names for these people if they're just the crowd. Folksonomy is a name for a list of words that were not created by experts, but were created by the people who use the information. So taxonomy, get it? Folksonomy. Folk is people, right? Just general old folks out there creating this organization, creating these categories. They call those a folksonomy. So it's not like it's a job title, folksonomist. It's that we call the things, these organizations of information that are created by just general people out there, we often call them folksonomies. Social tagging is another word for this kind of crowd creation of organization. Collaborative tagging, social indexing, those are all words that we use to describe the people out there in cyberspace all doing it collaboratively at the same time. Okay, so that same division we've seen before between either the experts could be doing it or regular old people who just happen to come in contact with the information could be doing it. All right, so now on to each of these four. We have the hierarchies, we have the indexes, we have the links, and we have the sequences. Let's look at an example of each of these inside of Wikipedia. I chose Wikipedia for a couple of reasons for these examples. First is because it's great. I mean, it has very clear examples of each one of these kinds of organizations. But B, because we're going to be moving into working a little bit with Wikipedia. So usually I would choose Google because we're in the Google module, but Wikipedia is a much better way to explore these concepts, and so I'm going to use Wikipedia as the examples. Okay, starting with a hierarchy. The best way to think about a hierarchy is that it's a table of contents. It's the great table of contents of whatever, your website, your information system. In this case, it's the table of contents of Wikipedia. So at the top of the table of contents in a book is the title of the book. Right? We have the title of the book followed by all the major headings in the book. Right? That's the way that the table of contents works. Other ways of thinking about a hierarchy is a tree. Other ways of thinking about a hierarchy is parents and children, right? Classes and subclasses. Those are all other ways, but the way that I think is easiest for you to look at it, because that's the way that you're going to find it most often as you travel around the web, is as a kind of a table of contents. So here we have the table of contents for Wikipedia. Starts with Wikipedia itself, sort of the label or the logo of Wikipedia. And then you can see the top level of the table of contents of Wikipedia. We have ads and biography, geography, history, mathematics, science, etc. And then we have an entry for technology. If I click on the entry for technology, I'll see the subheadings under technology, all the words that group up to be technology. Or looking at it from the other angle, technology breaks down in all these other words, the first of which is agriculture. And I can go down yet another level. So I click on agriculture and I get this thing on Wikipedia called subcategories. And the subcategories give me yet the next. Notice the word there, subcategories, right? Categories and subcategories, that's what a hierarchy is all about. It's information, under information, under information, under information, under information. In Wikipedia, since there's so darn much of it, they have lots and lots of levels. The more information, the bigger the book, in effect, the more has to be in the table of contents and the more levels there are in the table of contents. Okay, so this idea of hierarchy is an idea of levels. It's an idea of a table of contents. It's an idea of things inside of things inside of things. And the example we have here for Wikipedia starts at the Wikipedia logo, starts and then goes down to the first level of categories, the first level of headings, the first level of subjects, then into the second level, then into the third level, and in Wikipedia we can go a lot further than just the third level. That's just where I stopped. Okay, that's organization number one. This example shows you a couple of things. It shows you the concept of a hierarchy, but it also shows you the user interface behind this particular hierarchy. Is there only one user interface for a hierarchy? You start looking around and you will realize that there's a lot of ways of showing hierarchy, showing outlines, showing tables of contents, showing this parent and child thing on the web. Every website basically has some form of hierarchy on it. And it's the categories and subcategories that define the content, the information that's on that website. So I show you this one just by way of example, but this is far from the only example. There's examples everywhere of hierarchies on the web. And really, if you get nothing else out of this piece of the course, it's to start looking at these things, start trying to figure out what they are and what they tell you about the information that's behind them, behind the scenes. So when I see a hierarchy on the web, I start thinking, okay, behind the scenes, someone must have organized all this information into sort of an outline form. All right, hierarchy. Next. Come on, need to get my thing to advance here. Okay, oh sorry, I wanted to show you a couple of deliverables along the hierarchy, in the hierarchy realm. So I'm a information architect. I'm trying to create a hierarchy. What might I do? The deliverable that I'm showing you here is called a card sort. We take all the words that we think might describe this information, we put them all on little stickies, and then we tell people, organize these. Put them into, you know, subjects and classes, you know, put them into sort of an outline. I'm not really sure how to do that. I want your input. And we get lots of different people to do that. It gives us ideas about how we should organize this stuff into categories and subcategories. What things are really the same, what things don't the users understand, what categories are obvious, what categories are not obvious. So this deliverable of a card sort, we put all the words on cards, we get people to organize them, the end users, the people who are going to be using the system, we get to organize them, and then we learn from it. And from that we decide what way we want to, you know, how we want to organize the information, how we want to make the hierarchy inside the system. Okay, that's deliverable number one in the hierarchy world. Deliverable number two is a sitemap. So the sitemap starts with a home page, and it says from the home page we go down, down, down into more and more specific pages. So this website is organized a lot like a book. Home page is the cover of the book. Then chapter one is section one of the home of the website, and then under that we have section, subsection, and then subsection, and then subsection, and then we have section two, subsection, 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 section three, subsection, subsection, etc., etc. So the sitemap is a hierarchical view of the way the website works, the way the website looks, and that sitemap is almost, you know, it's a big deliverable. It's a big thing that people put together for their sites. Now, interestingly, I'm not sure if I showed you this in a video or not yet. I can't remember in what video it shows up in this class, but somewhere in this class there's someone who says this view of websites is really mistaken. And why? Because people don't really go from the home page down into the site. They don't look at home pages like, I mean, they don't look at websites like we look at books. They look at websites because they came to a very particular page right in smack in the middle of the website from Google. Right? They did a Google query and they don't go to the home page of the website, they go to some page in the middle of it. So from this guy's standpoint, the best way to look at websites, where did I put that video? From this guy's standpoint, the best way to look at websites is from the inside out, from the pages that people are likely to land on in the website, then where do they go from there? So this is a little bit more of a traditional view of a website. I wouldn't say that it's a wrong view. I'd just say it's a very different view than the view that I'm going to randomly land on some page in the middle of the website, never really see the home page, and navigate from there. Okay, so at any rate, the deliverables behind hierarchy. One I showed you is a card sort, and that card sort has end users, has people who are going to use the system helping us figure out how to organize the information hierarchically. Number two is sitemaps that say, what is the table of contents for this website? How will all the pages of this website be organized hierarchically? And they're often delivered in diagrams that look like the one on this page. Alrighty. So now we have the concept of an index. And we've talked already about the full text index, called lots of things, but my preferred term for it is the full text index. We talked about the Google one, and remember what Google does is it goes out, spiders the web, grabs all the pages, shakes all the words off the pages, puts them in a long alphabetical list with links back to the page and the position on the page where that information came from. Right? That's the Google thing. And when I told you originally about this Google index, I said all indexes share a few things. They're alphabetical or numerical lists of terms, and they point to the places where that term is used. right? That describes this Google index, but it also describes a more sort of traditional index, one that you're likely to see. You're never likely to see the Google index, but you are likely to see the index, for example, on Wikipedia. So here's an index on Wikipedia, and you can just by glancing at it says portal contents, portal meaning the wiki, right? Portal meaning Wikipedia, A to Z index. You can see, I think, really quickly that there is a lot of information on Wikipedia. Just to even show the, how do you get to something, you have to go down 2 levels. There's this, the A to Z index, and it doesn't just say, it doesn't, for like the index in the back of the book, it just doesn't list all A, B, C, D, E, F, all the terms. It actually has links. So here's a link not even to the A's, but to the AAs, the ABs, the ACs. That's how much stuff there is on Wikipedia, that they need to organize the index by having 2 levels of clicking before you actually get to the real index terms. So this may seem to you to be a hierarchy because I'm clicking down, down, down. Under AA goes to, whatever the listing for AA things, and then finally down to the bottom, but it's really not a hierarchy, it's really an index. And that index shows alphabetically every word that's in Wikipedia and how you would get to it, and then points, as all indexes do, points to the page that contains that information. So we have a term, click on the term, you go to the page that describes that information, just like all indexes. Okay, so you get the idea. This is a user interface. This is the user interface to the index of Wikipedia. The information on Wikipedia is organized by index. It's organized hierarchically. It's also organized by index. And when I present that index, when I show that index to users like you, I put it in this user interface. I put it in this presentation so that you'll have a way to interact with it, so that you'll have a good experience of finding the information that you want. Okay, tying it all back up to the largest concept of this lecture called user experience. Okay, so let's move now to links. And links are also called associations, and the reason is because they associate one piece of information with another. You see on the page here a typical Wikipedia page, and it happens to be the page on Google. And of course, this is where things get very familiar, but I want to take these familiar things and make them just a little strange to you. So you have all these blue terms, right? All the blue terms on the word. What are those? Those are links, right? So that's the easiest way to think of links. But how I really want you to think of links is that they're associations. They're associating this Google page to other pages. All those blue words are other pages that this page is associated to. If you took all the links of all the pages that all the pages are associated to, and you made a little diagram about them, you'd show something that looks a whole lot like a web, right? Nodes, each node in the web or network, each node is pointing to other ones in each of those strings like we talked about before. Does that sound familiar? Remember the social network, the social graph? That diagram, which I have in the corner of this page, that shows all the people and who they're all connected to? How about all the web pages and who they're all connected to? That's the same sort of structure. So this structure is not the same as a hierarchy. It's not the same as an index. It's a third structure. It's the structure of how information is interrelated to each other through links or through associations. So we have the hierarchy, we have the index, and now we have links or associations. And those links or associations take one piece of information and associate it to others. The user interface for those links, the ways those links are presented, is through blue text on a page. Right? Could have lots of different ways of representing them, and just like with indexes, just like with hierarchies, if you look around the web, you'll see all sorts of ways that these links, that these associations, the things that create the web structure of the web, how they're represented, how they're presented, how they're shown to you on a page. Okay, so here's a little deliverable that's associated with links, and it's called a node map or a concept map. And these are often used to brainstorm your way through what is all this about. Like, I want to create a website in this case, so let's just say we want to create a website about the Earth. And we start brainstorming all the different concepts that have to do with the Earth. One way to do it would be we'd make an outline, right? That would be a hierarchical approach to this brainstorming exercise. Another way we could do it is just list all the words alphabetically and say, well, we got to somehow cover all these words. Another way to do it would be to take all the words, put them on a page, and arrange them and draw lines between them to show how they're all related. And when you do that, just like I show in this diagram here, you end up with something that looks like a web, right? Because lots of things are interrelated to lots of other things. And that's the difference between this web structure and the other structures we've talked about. This web structure is much more free form. You move from topic to topic, from node to node, from item of information to item of information, really in all sorts of directions. Whereas in the other ones, it's much more structured, and it's much more, we've decided ahead of time how all this stuff is put together. In links, you really move quickly from one place to another. So lots more I could talk about in all of these subjects. I'm just giving you the tip of the iceberg, but if you're interested in this stuff, there's certainly resources for going much further into it. Okay, so the deliverable is a concept map. That concept map may help us understand how to interlink all of the information so that it's organized by links or by associations. Maybe we've already created a list of terms for our index. Maybe we've already created an outline for our hierarchy. Now we're creating a third thing. Okay, so onto the last kind of organization that we're going to talk about, a sequence. The sequence, as I described it before, is sort of like beads on the string. We go a next thing. And I showed you a sequence. Sequences are a little bit harder to find because they're just not as well utilized as links and indexes and hierarchies are on the web. Lots of information is sequentially, but the user interface for those sequences, the way that the sequences are presented on the screen, is often not as accessible, and it's just a less well used form of organization, I must say. Okay, so here I did find one, however. And a typical way of organizing information sequentially is to put it all on a timeline. So here's a Wikipedia timeline, and you can see that each of those little blocks is associated with a date, and you're kind of intended to go from the first one to the second one to the third one to the fourth one, and to see them in sequence, to read them in sequence. It's kind of like a story, right? We're telling a story one event at a time, and this event came before this event, and we should look at the first event, and then look at the second event, and then look at the third event. That's how sequences work. So this is one form of sequence. And the deliverable that we might look at for a sequence is what's called a storyboard. So a storyboard is a way of telling a story. A story is a sequence. A story is a sequence of events, right? Think of any story you've ever heard, and it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? Things come next in the story. You don't jump around from the beginning to the end to back to the middle, right? That's the way that we think of stories. They're in sequence. And sometimes, if you're being in a fancy movie, they will jump around in time, but in the end, you take all of that and think about it. You do this. You take it all and you sort it out in your mind. The reason it's presented not in sequence is just to make it more interesting. But in the end, when the movie's over, you take all those pieces and you rearrange them so that you can tell the story from beginning, middle, and end, because that's the way that we remember stories. That's how sequences work inside of our minds. So a deliverable along these lines is a storyboard. The storyboard is a way of showing the sequence. 1, 2, 3. It's kind of like a cartoon. When I think of storyboards, that's exactly what I think of. I think of cartoons. They show a little event with some dialogue, maybe, next event with some dialogue, next event with some dialogue, etc. Okay, so presented a lot of stuff in this lecture. Let me just jump back for a second and kind of review where we've been in this lecture. We started with this concept of user experience and said the user experience is overall how people do stuff, how interacting with your information system. We talked about some of the deliverables that have to do with people in the user experience realm, specifically with the people who pay for the system, with the people who construct the system, and with the people who use the system. Then we jumped into this idea of information architecture, and we said that information architecture is modeling, which we did a little review of, and life cycle, which we did a little review of. And then within that life cycle, we zoomed in. We focused in on that organized information part, because that's really a core piece of information architecture. And if I wanted to go to the core of the core, I said the core is modeling and life cycle. If I wanted to go even deeper into the core, I would say that the core is modeling and organization, and that's really the core of information architecture. Knowing what each piece of information is made of and knowing how all those pieces of information relate to each other, that's the dead center of information architecture. And so that's where we dove in this lecture, into that dead center, organizing the information, and we've already talked before about representing the information.